Well, good morning. Happy Sabbath. So good to see you, and I'm going to say it's so good to hear you. You know, I love hearing your voices. I love hearing you praise. I love hearing you sing. And it's a wonderful and refreshing thing that we're in the house of the Lord worshiping together. And such a joy for me to be here with you all. And of course, you may not know, I hope you know, that we're here this weekend doing some leadership training. And I am grateful that I have this privilege to spend at least these moments with you. And so thank you for having me here today. You know, it's interesting because I think that there's something that each one of us can probably understand, appreciate, agree upon. And that is, it's amazing how each day, stacked upon one another, that we find ourselves, whether it's at the end of a day, at the end of a week, tired, exhausted, weary. And you know, I believe that the Lord understood what we would need, and therefore has given us Sabbath, right? And what a joy it ought to be for each and every one of us. But I want to share this with you because this is kind of the context, if you will, for the message that we're about to hear in just a few moments. And that is that I do believe that each one of us, whether it's today, yesterday, whether it's coming up or whatever it might be, find ourselves weary, find ourselves exhausted, find ourselves as though there's no strength, there's no energy, we're beat mentally as well as physically, and oftentimes we groan when that alarm goes off in the morning. You know, it's interesting, especially, you know, as I have my wife next to me and that our alarm goes off, she's usually getting up before me because she gets in the shower before I do. And when that alarm rings, there are days that I hear, oh. And we do that, don't we? We do that. And yet, God, it's amazing how God just grants us what we need for that day. And so today, I want to be able to speak to you, the weary one, the tired and exhausted, the one who feels as though there's nothing left to give. And so with that, I'd just like to invite us to have a word of prayer. Father God, I want to thank you so much for allowing us this opportunity to open up your word. And as we do so, God, I pray for a refreshing. I pray for a re-energizing. I pray for your Spirit to come into this place, but more importantly, into our hearts. That God, that you would restore our strength. May it be mentally, may it be physically, may it even be spiritually. And so I pray that as we do open up your word, may your Holy Spirit teach us all things, and may he guide us into all truth. This we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to spend our time in Mark chapter 6. And so I want to invite you to go with me to the book of Mark chapter 6. And when you open up the Gospel of Mark, it feels very different from the other Gospels. Mark doesn't waste words. His sentences are short. His pace is quick. His stories are urgent. And over again, he uses one of his favorite words, and that word is immediately. Everything happens in motion in the Gospel of Mark because the people that he's writing to are living in motion, trying to survive in a world that is pressing hard against them. And there's something that's very fascinating that we're going to find here in this story that we're going to be getting into here in the Gospel of Mark chapter 6. And that is that we're finding that the story involves the disciples. However, the disciples are mirroring the audience to which Mark is writing to. And so I want us to understand this. And so therefore, because we are the audience, right, to which Mark is writing to, that means that we ought to find ourselves and see ourselves in the disciples in this story. Now, Mark is writing to believers in Rome. And Christians that are living under persecution, they are weary, they are anxious, they're frightened. Their faith is costing them everything. Many are being rejected by family. They're hunted by the empire. And some are even facing death for following Christ. Now, these are not comfortable believers. They are a tired, pressured, persecuted church. And that's what makes Mark's gospel so powerful. He isn't writing a slow meditation. He's writing a lifeline. And every word is written to remind struggling believers that even when life feels chaotic, Jesus is still in control. And this is something that's so important. And I want to encourage you with this, that when you find yourself down and out, when you find yourself persecuted, when you find yourself anxious, when you find yourself separated from God for whatever reason, turn to the Gospel of Mark, because this is why it was written. And so I want you to be mindful of this. And so when Mark tells the story of Jesus and his disciples in Mark chapter 6, he's not just telling history, he's holding up a mirror. His readers are living what the disciples are feeling, worn out, overwhelmed, unsure how much longer they can keep going. And by this point in the story, the disciples have been on mission. They've seen Jesus heal the sick. They've seen him cast out demons, calm storms, speak to the crowds. And now they've been sent out themselves, 2 by 2, here at the beginning of chapter 6, to preach, to heal, to cast out unclean spirits, to do what Jesus modeled to them. It's their first taste of ministry on their own, and their experience has drained them dry. And so I want you to notice Mark chapter 6, and we're going to look at verse 31. But I want us to look at the very last part of verse 31. And there it says, "For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time," what does it say? To eat. Doesn't that sound like us? You know, I was so busy yesterday that I didn't even have time to stop and eat. I didn't have time to prepare a meal. You know, we do this often, don't we? This is our experience. We understand this. They did not even have time to eat. Now, that's not just a passing detail that Mark mentions here. It's a picture of their exhaustion. They're physically depleted. They're emotionally drained and is spiritually stretched thin. They've given everything that they have, and now there's nothing left. That's exactly how Mark's readers would have felt, trying to hold on to their faith while the world around them seemed to be collapsing. The disciples' weariness is their weariness. And what does Jesus do? You know, Jesus doesn't scold them. He doesn't say, do more or try harder. Notice what he says at the beginning of verse 31. Let's look at that again. "And he said to them, 'Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while.'" You know, it's okay to rest. It's okay to go off on a retreat. It's okay to go off by yourself. Jesus did this often. We can see this throughout the Gospels. As a matter of fact, Spirit of Prophecy says that there was none busier than Jesus Christ. And even in the busiest times and moments of his life, you will find him spending all night in prayer. And it's very interesting that he would then in the morning go about doing it all over again. And it's interesting because it says that he would find strength in communion with his Father. He would find an energy that, you know, oftentimes we think, well, I just need to sleep more. I just need an hour's worth more of sleep. Well, I just need to go to bed earlier and then I'll have the strength. When really, the secret is really spending more time with the Father. Just like Jesus. And this is where he found his strength. And it almost doesn't make sense, does it? Because we think that the body needs sleep. We think that the body needs rest. And absolutely it does. But we need Jesus more. We need him. And it's amazing what he can do for the body and for the mind. You know, that invitation to let's come away, let's rest a while, let's go to a place by ourselves, to a deserted place. What does that mean? A place where there are no people. A place where there's no distraction. A place where we can just focus and rest in Jesus. And this is what he's inviting them to do. That invitation is the heartbeat of the passage and the heartbeat of Mark's gospel. Jesus doesn't just care about the mission, he cares about the messengers. He cares about their weakness. He sees their limits. He sees their fatigue, and he invites them to rest. Let's notice verse 34. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep, not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. Now it's very interesting because right before this, it's interesting because they're on their way to this deserted place because Jesus invites them, right? Come away to a deserted place, let's rest a while. And the people catch a glimpse of where they're headed. And so they're going across on the boat, and the people see them, knowing that Jesus is going to end up on the other side, and they run to that place. And so the thing is that what we're finding here is that they cannot get a moment's peace. They cannot get the rest that they so desperately need. They want to so bad, and yet the needs of the people are so great that they're looking for Jesus to provide them with something. And so they go and they come to this place, and when Jesus sees them, it says that he has this compassion for the people. He has this love for the people. Before Jesus and his disciples can catch their breath, the crowds find them. Thousands of people come running from every direction, desperate and hungry for what Jesus offers. And this is where the story turns. Where the compassion of Jesus meets the exhaustion of his followers. For Mark's audience, and for us, this moment is deeply personal. Because like those early disciples, they were trying to serve in a season of suffering. They were trying to keep giving when it felt like there was nothing left to give. And in this moment, Jesus isn't just teaching a lesson to the 12. He's demonstrating something that his church in every generation needs to learn. When you don't have enough time, enough energy, enough strength, bring what you do have to me. Mark's first readers needed to hear that, and we need to hear that too. Because when you're empty and when you're tired and when you're standing in front of needs that you can't possibly meet, that's where Jesus begins his work. That's the setup for the miracle of the loaves and the fish. It's not abundance, but emptiness. It's not strength, but surrender. And it's in that space between exhaustion and obedience that Jesus reveals who he really is and what he can really do. That word, you saw that word compassion, right? He looked upon the people and he has this compassion. Now, this word compassion, it's an interesting word because in the original language it's the word splagnitzomai. Splagnitzomai. And so this is the Greek word that you would find here. Now, when you look at this particular word, especially within the Greek, it is not a word that is like, oh, I feel really sorry for them. That's not the compassion this is talking about. This is not, this feeling that, poor people. It's more than that. What this word implies is that there is it doesn't just mean pity, it means a gut level ache. Okay, that's what this means, a gut level ache. It is a feeling that originates from the very depths and the very soul of Jesus Christ. Okay, it's almost like it pains him, okay, to look upon this people. This is the type of compassion that he has. And you see, this is the compassion that feels pain and acts upon it. Okay? That's what this word compassion really means for this people. But here's the beauty of it. His compassion does not begin with the crowd. It doesn't. It begins with his disciples. Just moments earlier, he saw their weariness. He saw their hunger. He saw their fatigue. And he had compassion on them too. It's very interesting what we find here in Mark chapter 6, Mark chapter 7, Mark chapter 8. There is a theme that is going on here. And it's very interesting because the disciples seem to be at the very center of it. Even to the point where in Mark chapter 8, towards the end of Mark chapter 8, you remember in Mark chapter 8 you have the feeding of the 4,000. In Mark chapter 6 you have the feeding of the 5,000. There's two feedings, significant miracles that have taken place. And it's interesting because the disciples are talking amongst themselves there in chapter 8, and they're trying to figure out, we don't understand the meaning of these things. We don't understand the bread. And as a matter of fact, it even says there, they only had one loaf of bread with them. You'll find, I would really challenge you, when you read the Gospel of Mark, read 6, 7, and 8, and count how many times you find the word bread. Because you're going to find a significant amount of the uses of the word bread. And it's fascinating because there's something that Mark is trying to convey, something that Mark is trying to communicate to each and every one of us. And so when he's speaking of the disciples there, it's interesting because they don't get it. And it's fascinating because even Jesus, when he sees that they're talking amongst themselves, he says, he overhears them and he says, wait a minute, you saw the feeding of the 5,000 and you saw that there were 12 baskets left over, and then you saw the feeding of the 4,000 and how there were 7 baskets left over, and then he says, how is it that you don't get it? How is it that you don't understand? And I'm sure that as we're reading it, we're thinking, wait a minute, I'm trying to figure this out myself. I don't get it. I don't understand. And throughout this whole time, Jesus is trying to teach his disciples something. And it seems like, you know what, you find that in 6, 7, and 8 that Jesus is performing these miracles, and there's so much that is happening. As a matter of fact, you'll find that there's the Syrophoenician woman in chapter 7, and you find that there's a deaf individual in chapter 7, and chapter 8 you've got a blind individual that gets healed, and all of it's tied together. And you think, well, he's doing all these miracles for these people, but the reality is that in the midst of all of this, Jesus is trying to teach the disciples something. He's trying to get their attention. He's trying to get them to see something about himself, and they're just not getting it. Now you see, what's fascinating about the Gospel of Mark is that when you read the Gospel, this is intentional. You don't get it. You don't get it. You don't get it. You don't get it. Why is Jesus doing this? Why is Jesus doing that? And you know when finally the epiphany takes place? It's in chapter 15, when Jesus is upon the cross. And it's fascinating because there, right before the cross, you have the centurion that looks up to him and he says, truly, this man is the Son of God. And it's fascinating that is the conclusion that Mark desires for every reader to have when it comes to Jesus and reading the Gospel of Mark. Truly, this is the Son of God. And so the disciples are dense through this whole process, but yet Jesus is still teaching them, teaching them, teaching them. And so he has this compassion for them. The same Jesus who feels the ache for the multitude. He feels the ache of the minister. He sees the servant who's poured out more than they have left to give. He sees the parent who's worn thin. The leader who's stretched too far. The believer who's running on empty. And when he looks upon you and when he looks upon me, his compassion is not distant. It's not casual. It's not a pat on the back and a you'll be fine. It's a love that moves towards your need. Even in his own weariness, Jesus still chooses compassion. You know, and this is the beautiful thing that we have to understand as well. Jesus is tired. Jesus is weary. He's exhausted. He's hungry. And even in his own weariness, Jesus still chooses compassion. When we would have turned away, he draws near. When we would have said, not today, he says, I see you. The compassion of Christ is not a soft feeling. It's a divine force. It sees, it feels, and it acts. And in this story, that compassion is about to act. Not only for the crowd, but for the disciples too. And Mark leaves us on that hillside. The sun is setting over a sea of faces. The disciples are weary. The master is watching. And you can almost feel it in the air. Something is about to happen. Notice verse 35. And when the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, this is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Now I want you to picture this. Not only do I want you to try to picture it and see it in your mind, but I want you to try to hear it as well. You can almost hear the fatigue in their voices. These men have just come back from their first missionary journey. They've been preaching, teaching, healing the sick, casting out demons, pouring themselves out for days on end. And when they returned, the crowds kept coming. They've had no time to rest, no time to eat, no time even to breathe. And now the day is slipping away. The sun is lowering. The crowd is pressing in, and their energy is gone. They're not being selfish here. They're being human. Let them go eat. And I'm sure it might even sound like compassion for them. But I'm sure that they were saying it for themselves. And so I want us to hear that. Notice the first part of verse 37. But he answered and said to them, you give them something to eat. Can you feel that moment? It's as though Jesus has just handed them an impossible assignment. They're already running on empty. And now he asks them to feed thousands. Now, I don't know, if you've ever been in a large crowd of people, which I'm sure most of you have, okay? 5,000 people, that's a lot of people, okay? Now, it actually says 5,000 men, okay? Now, this is what we have to consider and think about, is that feeding 5,000 people, you start with it. You start breaking out the calculator, and it's like, checking your wallet, and checking your... There's absolutely no way that we have enough resource in order to meet this particular need. And this is what's going on with the disciples when Jesus then tells them, you give them something to eat. It's very interesting because this statement of Jesus is intentional. It's purposeful. There's something behind it. The disciples don't know it yet. They don't see it yet. But there's something that's here that Jesus is trying to open the door towards. If you could hear their thoughts, you'd probably hear, Lord, we don't even have strength for ourselves, and you want us to feed them? This command doesn't make sense to weary men. They've been serving nonstop, and now the very thing that they're short on is the very thing that Jesus asks of them. They respond in disbelief. And still in verse 37, after he says, you give them something to eat, and they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? I don't know how many of you realize, but 200 denarii worth of bread is about 8 months worth of wages. Okay? About 8 months worth of wages. They're saying, even if we could, Lord, there's not enough. There's not enough. And here's where we start to see what Jesus is doing. There's something he's trying to communicate. Something the disciples aren't yet understanding. He's showing them that in and of themselves, they do not have enough. And yet, here's the problem. The need still remains. The need still remains. The people are still hungry. The need is still there. The people still need to be fed. You know, that's the tension of ministry and life. The gap between our insufficiency and the world's great need. And Jesus is leading them, and us, to discover that the answer is never found in our ability to meet the need, but in his ability to work through what we surrender to him. This is the key. And then in verse 38, Jesus asks the question that changes everything. But he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. I love that. He says, go and see. Now, I want you to pay attention to the question as to what it is versus what it is not. Because what it is really not the way that we approach a circumstance like this. Because the way that we usually approach the circumstance is with what it's not. I don't know if you're following me here just yet. But he says, go and see. He asks the question, what do you have? Right? Go and see. He does not ask the question, what do you not have? Okay? He does not ask that question, what do you not have? But I will tell you that what we do not have is many times what we focus on when there is a need before us. Are you following? Because when we see the need, we think to ourselves, I do not have such a this and these and those in order to meet the need. But again, that's not the question that Jesus is asking, is it? He's asking, what do you have? And again, Jesus is doing something here. Again, the disciples aren't getting it. And so he's not demanding what they cannot give. Understand this, brothers and sisters. Jesus is not demanding what they cannot give. He simply says, how many loaves do you currently have? Bring me what's in your hands. That's so key, brothers and sisters. It is so key that we understand what Jesus is doing here. And so what does this mean? What he is asking them to do is to do an examination. He's asking them to do an inventory. Okay? What do you have? Okay? Here is our problem. Once again, we so often focus upon what we don't have, on what's missing, on what's lacking, on what we wish we could give. But that's not the question that Jesus asked. The question isn't, what don't you have? The question is, what do you have? And they tell him, as we finish verse 38, and when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Now, of course, when we go into another gospel, we see the origin of that 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? And it came from a little boy, right? That was given a lunch by his mother. And so we look at this, and that is that this lunch was meant to feed a little boy. Not a multitude. It wasn't even meant to feed a family. It was meant to feed one boy. That's all. 5 small loaves and 2 fish. And I'm sure you can picture, because it's like they're looking at the 5 loaves and 2 fish. They look at the crowd. 5 loaves and 2 fish. The crowd, the math isn't mathing. This is not making sense, you see. They can count the loaves, they can see the crowd, and the numbers don't add up. And maybe that's the question that starts to arise in our hearts too. Was what they had enough? From a human perspective, no. Again, it wasn't enough to even feed a family, much less a multitude. But here's what's fascinating. In the hands of Jesus, yes, it was enough. Why? Because he asked them to bring what they had. He never told them to solve the problem. Even, and we have to understand this, even when he told them, you give them something to eat, he knew that this was an impossibility from a human standpoint. And so there was never an intent on Jesus' part that they would feed the multitude. What that question was to simply open a door. It was to get them to start processing the situation. It was to pave the way for Jesus to demonstrate a powerful miracle that they never would have expected. That's what that question did. And you see, he never told them to solve the problem. What he did is he told them to surrender the little that they possessed. That was it. And here's where it meets us. How many times have we felt like we're not doing enough? We're not giving enough. We're not producing enough. We reach into our pockets for more, and we find ourselves empty. There is nothing left in our pockets. And it's amazing, brothers and sisters, and this is not to criticize. It really isn't, okay? But oftentimes we find this, not just around our conference, but we see it in other churches and conferences around. That oftentimes when we get up here to do an offering appeal, we're asking people to dig deeper into their pockets, right? But when we're scraping the bottom of the barrel, and there's nothing more to give, what do we do? And the issue is that oftentimes in these offering appeals, we're talking about how we're short on our mortgage this month. We're short on our bills. We're short on this. We're short on that. We need you to dig deeper. There's a mountain of need, and yet we're asking, well, dig deeper. And when we hear dig deeper, we think to ourselves, I've dug as deep as I can go. And of course, brothers and sisters, this isn't just about money. This isn't just about money. And so as we look at this, we reach into our pockets for more energy, more ideas, more strength, and we find that our pockets are still empty. We look at the needs around us and at the 5 loaves and 2 fish left in our hands, and we think, this cannot possibly be enough. But Jesus isn't asking us to fill the need. He's asking us to trust him with what we have. The miracle doesn't start with the plenty. The miracle starts when the empty-handed come to Jesus anyways. He doesn't ask you to be the answer. He asks you to simply bring what you have and let him be the answer through you. Now let's keep reading in Mark chapter 6, and let's start with verse 39. And it says, then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks, in hundreds and in 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them, and the 2 fish, and he divided among them all. Now, here we find something fascinating. There is something that Jesus does here in verse 41 that oftentimes we just gloss over. And we just read over and we just simply bypass it. But what's interesting is that what Mark communicates here in verse 41 gets repeated 2 more times in the Gospel of Mark. And it's very interesting. You'll see it in Mark chapter 8. And then you're going to see it, oh boy, Mark chapter 14. I believe it's Mark chapter 14 in the upper room story. Okay, the upper room story. And I'm just going to give you just a quick commercial, because honestly, this is just another sermon, really is what it is. But what's interesting is that there are 4 things that Jesus does. Now, there's a lot that's happening here. Okay, here in this chapter, there's a lot that's happening in the Gospel of Mark. And there's so many conclusions that we can draw from these stories. And one of the things that's very fascinating, another theme that we find within the Gospel of Mark, is the messianic secret. You ever heard of the messianic secret? Anybody ever heard of the messianic secret? Now, the messianic secret is very interesting, because what we find is that Jesus is performing miracles. He's speaking, he's doing this, he's doing that, he's ministering, and so on. And especially when he performs a miracle, and you'll start seeing it in chapter 1, right around verse 24, I believe it is, 22, 23, 24, when he heals a man possessed with demons. And it's interesting, because when he performs a miracle, oftentimes what you're going to hear Jesus say is, make sure that you don't tell anybody about this. Okay, make sure you don't tell anybody. And it's almost like Jesus is trying to keep this quiet. It's almost like he's trying to hide his identity. And so scholars call this the messianic secret. And it's not until we get to Mark chapter 10, where we have the story of blind Bartimaeus. Remember the story of blind Bartimaeus? And blind Bartimaeus starts crying out. He says, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And it's fascinating, because Jesus doesn't quiet him. It's the disciples that are saying, Lord, you want us to shut him up? And then it says, he cries out even more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And what's significant about this is that term, or that phrase, Son of David, is a messianic title. It is strictly a messianic title. And this is just before Jesus goes to the cross. And so now that he's heading to the cross is now when his identity is fully being revealed. And it's fascinating. But yet, throughout the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is trying to get the attention of his disciples. It is almost as though he's like, hello, I'm right here. Hey, do you guys see me? Hi, are you guys listening? This is what he's doing throughout the entire time. This is why you're going to find a significant number of the uses of the word bread in 6, 7, and 8. Because Jesus is trying to get them to understand him. He is the bread of life. And so there are 4 things that are being done. Can you identify them in verse 41? The first thing that he does is what? He takes the loaves. The second thing is what? He what? He looks up to heaven, yes. Okay, we're going to bypass that one. What does he do when he looks up to heaven? He blesses. Okay, he blesses. The third thing, he breaks the bread. And then the fourth, he gave. So he what? Takes. The second, he blesses. The third, he breaks. And the fourth, he gives. This pattern is what you're going to find repeated. And it's very interesting that it happens here in the feeding of the 5,000. Then it happens in the feeding of the 4,000. Okay, you'll see it in chapter 8. And then in chapter 14, it's interesting when they're in the upper room. It says that Jesus took the bread. He blessed it. He broke it. And then gave it to his disciples. And it should have been at that moment that it's like, oh, we get it now, Jesus. We see it clearly. This is what Mark is trying to do, is to get us to see Jesus. And so as we look at this pattern, there's something significant about this pattern. This pattern, it is a pattern that still defines how God works with us today. So let's look at the he took. Jesus takes what the disciples bring. It's small. It's simple. It's inadequate. But he receives it anyway. He doesn't scold them for how little it is. He doesn't say, is that all you've got? He takes what they have, because what he desires more than anything isn't quantity, it's surrender. This is what's happening right now, is surrender is taking place. The miracle doesn't begin with the multitude, it begins with the master's hands. Whatever you place in his hands, your gifts, your energy, your calling, your time, your effort, is now in the safest place that it could ever be. However, in our estimation, when we do our examination, when we do our own inventory, we're always thinking, it's not enough. It's not enough. We possibly cannot fulfill what needs to be done in order to make a difference. And from the very beginning of the pattern, we already fail because we often try with our own strength and our own resources only to find that it isn't enough. We have to remember what the question is and what God expects us to do with the answer. Remember the question, what do you have? Go and see. Go take inventory. Go do an examination. The second thing, he blessed. He blesses it. He lifts it toward heaven, acknowledging that the provision and the power come from the Father. This is what Jesus is teaching his disciples. He takes what you give, and then he blesses it. He marks it for divine use. You may feel ordinary, but in his hands, ordinary things become sacred instruments. He blesses the bread before it feeds the soul. He blesses the servant before the work begins. The third thing he broke. He breaks it. And this is where it gets real. Because before the bread could feed others, it had to be broken. What is happening in the breaking? Jesus takes a piece of bread and he breaks it. Now picture this. So Jesus takes one piece of bread, he breaks it, and now he has how many? He's got two. Okay? You're going to put those pieces together, break it again. Now what do you have? You got 4 pieces. What is happening here? Multiplying is happening. Multiplying is happening. Jesus is beginning the process of taking the little that the disciples had, and he is now multiplying it. It's in the breaking that the multiplying happens. You see, as long as the bread remained whole, it could only feed one. But once broken, it could feed thousands because it's being multiplied. And that's the mystery of God's process. He breaks what he blesses, not to destroy it, but to multiply it, to distribute it. The gifts, the talents, the callings God gives us, they are taken, they're blessed, and then they are broken so they can then feed others. The breaking may come through hardship. The breaking may come through loss, through seasons that empty us, but those are often the very moments when God is preparing us for a greater use. Brokenness is not the end of your usefulness. It's the beginning of your multiplication. The disciples had to learn what it felt like. What felt like the end of their strength was really the beginning of his. His strength is made perfect in our weakness. Through the breaking of the gift, countless lives would ultimately be fed. And then the fourth thing, he gave. Notice the miracle's movement. Jesus doesn't hand the bread directly to the people. You notice that? It's interesting that he takes what the disciples gave, he blessed it, then he multiplied it, and then he puts it back into the hands of the disciples. That's so key. That is so key, brothers and sisters. He gives it back to the disciples for them to distribute. The same hands that once held so little now hold what only Jesus could provide. They become the channels through which his power flows. That is ministry, brothers and sisters. That is life in Christ. We do not minister on our own strength and our own power. We minister in his strength and his power and his provision. And what God does, he does through you and me as willing servants, as simple instruments, brothers and sisters. That's what it means to live a life in Christ. That is what ministry means. He takes what you have, he blesses it, he breaks it, and then he gives it back. Not diminished, but multiplied. The miracle happens not just in his hands, but through yours. Notice then verse 42. So they all ate and were what? Filled. In other words, they are satisfied. And then I want you to see verse 43. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. 12 baskets. Remember how weary and tired and exhausted and hungry they were? Now you might say each one of them had their own basket. There was 12 of them. One for every pair of hands that thought that they had nothing left to give. And it's interesting that in the ministry, in the pattern that God has set up, not only are the multitude fed and filled and satisfied, but it's interesting that the ministers themselves become fed, filled, and satisfied. But I thought I just needed more sleep. And right here is where we come back to the question at the heart of the message. How do you feed the hungry when you're starving? How do you serve when you feel empty? How do you give when your pockets are bare and your spirit is drained? You do it the same way that Jesus taught the disciples. You do it by following the pattern. He takes what you bring. He blesses what you surrender. He breaks what he's preparing to multiply. And then he gives it back, transformed, strengthened, overflowing. And that's how you feed the hungry when you're starving. You don't feed them from your strength. You feed them from his. You don't serve from what's left. You serve from what's been blessed and broken in his hands. The miracle was never about bread. It was about dependence. It was about trust. It was about learning that when your life passes through his hands, what once felt empty becomes more than enough. This story begins with tired disciples and it ends with full baskets. It begins with not enough and it ends with more than enough. And somewhere in between, everything changed. Not because they worked harder, but because they placed what they had in the hands of Jesus. That's the lesson for every servant of God. You don't have to be full to be faithful. You don't have to wait until your energy returns, until life feels stable, until your schedule clears up, until Jesus can use you when you're empty, if you'll just place what you have in his hands. And maybe that's where you are today. You've been serving faithfully. You've been showing up, but inside you're tired. You've been giving and giving. But lately it feels like you've got nothing left to give. And yet the needs still keep coming. The people still need to be fed. The demands of life haven't stopped. If anything, they've multiplied. And Jesus, with that same gentle compassion, looks upon you and me and he says, you give them something to eat. Not because he expects you to do it in your own strength, but because he's inviting you to trust him with your little. He's not asking you for what you don't have. He's asking for what's in your hands right now. That's how you feed the hungry when you're starving. You take what you have, however small, however tired, however broken, and you place it in his hands. He takes it, he blesses it, he breaks it, and then he gives it back. Multiplied beyond anything you could have imagined. And maybe today, your 5 loaves and 2 fish look like patience that's running out. Maybe it's energy that's almost gone. Maybe it's faith that is hanging by a thread. Whatever it is, it's enough when it's in his hands. Because when Jesus blesses it, it will always be enough. When Jesus breaks it, it will always multiply. And when Jesus gives it back, it will always satisfy. If you're empty, he sees you. If you're weary, he invites you. And if you'll place your life, your time, your strength, your gift into his hands, he'll do what he's always done. He'll feed the hungry through you. And in the process, he'll feed you too. And so if you're starving today, don't hold back what's in your hands. Give it to Jesus. Because in his hands, what seems to be too little is more than enough. God bless.